escape. Now, Frank Morris, he worked in the prison industries. He loved reading, and he read a magazine that was inside of the prison. This magazine was called Popular Mechanics. It was like a do-it-yourself magazine, told you instructions on how you can make things for yourself. And Frank noticed that there was an article that told you how you can make a life jacket and a raft out of raincoats. So that's a very useful article out here. So of course he contacted the England brothers, John and Clarence. Now John's job here on the island, when you pick up your audio tour, you're going to see the clothing area. That's where they would hand out the uniforms to the prisoners after they showered. Now he's collecting raincoats from various prisoners to make the rafts and the life jackets. His brother Clarence, he works in the prison barber shop. He cuts hair. He collects human hair because they're going to make 4 dummy heads that look like them, sleeping. And of course, Alan, what was his role? Well, he was a maintenance worker, and according to him, he was the mastermind of the escape because he actually got to see areas of the cell house that other people did not have access to. But Alan did not make it off of Alcatraz. The night of the escape, June 11th, 1962, only Frank and the England brothers made it off of this island. Alan West was left behind because that opening in the back of his cell was still too small. He needed more time to make it larger. They didn't have time. They left him behind, and he had to serve additional years on Alcatraz. All right, folks, I think we have everyone off of the ferry. So welcome to Alcatraz. My name is Wendy. I'm one of the rangers out here. And on behalf of the National Park Service, I'd like to welcome you to your national park.
United Indian property, Indian land. What's up with that? Why is that up there? Well, in 1969, after Alcatraz had closed, one of the largest occupations of government land happened right here. It was a protest that lasted 19 months long, and more than 15,000 people came through the island to give support for Native American sovereignty. What does all that mean? Why choose Alcatraz to have this protest? We have to go back in time to 1868, when there was a treaty between Native Americans and the federal government. It was called the Treaty of Laramie. In the Treaty of Laramie, it said, if federal property ever goes unused, story about the Native American occupation that lasted 19 months. We found out they had a lot of support, but I told you something happened to cause that support to suddenly stop. I let you know that we would be looking at a clue that would tell us what happened. You're all facing the clue. Any idea what I'm trying to get you to figure out? What happened? Fire, exactly.
That's what I told Rachel.
This at one time was the officers' club. It had a 2-lane bowling alley. They had big dinners and banquets for the guards and their families. During the Native American occupation, 3 buildings were set on fire. The officers' club, the warden's house, and the lighthouse keeper's house. Later today, you'll see those other 2 ruins of what remains after the fire. So, these fires happened, and now the local community is mad. Alcatraz is getting destroyed. So the donations of money, food, water, they all stop. And it becomes very difficult for the protesters to stay on this island. So slowly but surely, they all start to leave. On the very last day, there are only 15 protesters remaining. Remember, I told you in total 15,000. So a lot of them left. The last 15 are court-martialed off the island. The very next day, the government arrives and they start to bulldoze buildings down to the ground. Buildings that at one time were apartments for prison guards and their families. Buildings that the protesters were using to live in. So the government wanted to bulldoze them down to make it more difficult for a protest of that magnitude to ever happen again. Now, if you ask the protesters, did you start those 3 fires? They say they did not. They say that the government set the fires intentionally to make them lose the support. If you ask the government, did you start those fires? They also say, no, it was the protesters. So we have both sides pointing the finger at the other. Still today, we don't know who set those fires. We just know they happened. What we do know is that in addition to the government coming in and bulldozing buildings down, 2 years later, 1973, Alcatraz magically becomes a national park. If we go back to that Treaty of Laramie, the treaty that said unused government land can go return to Native Americans. Well, if this is a national park, technically it's still being used. Very, very tricky. You might be looking at me like, does this guy realize he's a park ranger? I do. Hopefully I have a job tomorrow. Check on me. In all seriousness, today the National Park Service is moving towards a place of telling the truth about what happened here. We're just presenting you with
partnership between the Indians of all tribes and the National Park Service. In 2019, it was the 50th anniversary of the protest. So some of the original occupiers and their children and their grandchildren all came to Alcatraz and retouched that red painting that we saw down at the dock that said Indian land, the red painting up on this water tower that also says Indian land. It was retouched so that we can start to tell you this untold story that many people don't even realize happened here. There's talks about a Native American cultural center being built on Alcatraz so that Native Americans can have their own presence here and tell you their side of the story themselves. Hopefully, we're working towards a bigger, better future with our Native American brothers and sisters. The federal prison. So let's tell our untold story that happened before it was a federal prison. Who knows what was here? Yes, everyone's right. I heard army, military, a fort. Correct. A military fort existed on this island. Anything that you see today that's made out of bricks is from the military era. This is because back then they didn't know that bricks don't hold up so well in California earthquakes. As time went on, they figured that out and they stopped using brick as often. But many of those brick structures are still standing today on Alcatraz. So why build a military fort on this island? Well, it's strategically located. Any ship sailing through the Golden Gate has to pass this island. It's in the perfect location naturally. So they start to build this military fort because something is happening in the United States in like the 1850s into the 1860s. I heard someone over here say the Civil War happening on the East Coast in the 1860s. Over here on the West Coast, we have the California Gold Rush. During the California Gold Rush, the population of San Francisco in 1848 was 1,000 people. By 1849, just 1 year later, 25,000 people because of the gold. So with this gold rush on the West Coast and the Civil War on the East Coast, there's this paranoia of an unknown enemy coming out here and sailing through the Golden Gate because the San Francisco Bay was seen as the key to the West Coast. So there was fear. That's why they built their military fort here. It did not see any action. But something that comes along with the military fort are military prisoners. Oftentimes, Alcatraz has this sensationalized phrase that you probably heard today on your boat ride here. They really love to hammer it home that Alcatraz had the worst of the worst. They love that, the worst of the worst, I'm about to tell you who the first military prisoners were. I'm going to tell you 3 groups of people. After telling you those 3 groups, y'all can be the judge on if they really were the worst of the worst. The first group are what are known as conscientious objectors. That is a fancy way of saying a person who refuses to fight in a war due to their own personal or religious beliefs. Many Amish people or Mennonite people were conscientious objectors. If you refuse to fight in a war, too bad, too sad, you can be imprisoned on a military base, like Alcatraz. Our second group of people are Native Americans. At the time, the United States government were going around and kidnapping Native American children from their tribe and sending them to boarding school to try and make them assimilate to United States culture. If these children were caught speaking their native language, their tongue was mutilated. Out near the Grand Canyon, there was a tribe called the Hopi. When the government came to take the Hopi's children from them, the Hopi fought back. Unsuccessfully. 19 Hopi elders were arrested and brought here to Alcatraz and imprisoned. The elders, the most important members of a tribe. The third group of people that were incarcerated here arrived when something happened over in the city in 1918 called the Baker Street Scandal. On Baker Street in San Francisco, there were 2 apartment buildings side by side. The neighboring community started to observe men going in and out of these apartments at all hours of the day and all hours of the night. Something was up. They alert the authorities. The authorities decide to investigate. So they send in an undercover informant. It is quickly discovered that on Baker Street, men are meeting up with other men for romantic relationships with one another. They're observed playing the piano, singing, dancing with each other, and dressing in dresses. It's 1918. So the authorities, they raid Baker Street. They lock the men up inside the apartments, and they force written confessions. They ask them for names. Who else is involved? They arrest 31 men and charge them all with sodomy. They were gay. Of those 31 men, 5 were military soldiers. Where do you suppose those 5 ended up? Boom, right here on Alcatraz. Sentenced to 10 years for being gay. So now we have conscientious objectors who refuse to fight in a war because it goes against who they are. We have Native Americans who refuse to have their children kidnapped and taken from them. And we have gay men. The worst of the worst? Maybe what they consider the worst of the worst back then was a heck of a lot different than what we consider the worst of the worst today. a moment to reflect. Who are we incarcerating today? In the United States, at this moment, there are 1.9 million people who are in prison. We have 25% of the world's incarcerated population here in the United States. Why? In 100 years from now, are we going to look back and wonder, what were we doing to those people? There's a brand new exhibit on the top of the hill called The Big Lockup. It dives into that very thing, mass incarceration in the United States today. Check it out. But back to these first prisoners of Alcatraz. They were given hard labor on this island. What does hard labor on Alcatraz look like? Well, they carved out the roads that we are walking up. At one time, Alcatraz was literally a rock covered in birdwood. 12-acre rock. I'm going to pause because that vehicle is coming to make this turn up. Alcatraz starts as a 12-acre rock covered in birdwood. But as they start carving out these roads and chipping away at the rock, they're taking the rock and throwing it over. Alcatraz grows from 12 acres to 24 acres. They got these roads finished, and then they have to put these men to work doing something else. Up until this time, their prison cells were on this side of the island. Earlier, we walked through a tunnel. Later today, go back to that tunnel. There's a room on the right. It has a hole in the back corner on the ground. Look down into that hole, and you will be looking at one of the very first prison cells of Alcatraz from the military era. Those jail cells were not holding up very well. They weren't working. So they put the men to work building a brand new cell house. That's this building right up here. They built that themselves. After they finished building it, who do you suppose the first ones locked up in work? It was them. Can you imagine how that must mess with your mind, building your own prison? They finish it, they're locked up inside of it. Time goes on. We get into the 1920s and the 1930s. Something starts to happen across the country, especially in cities like New York, Chicago. We have organized crime, mobsters, gangsters that start to pop up and enter the United States prison system. Quickly discovered that these men are pretty difficult to control. They're ruthless. They're very well connected. They'll murder each other. They'll try and escape. So it's decided that this country needs a super max security prison. All eyes land on this island, this military prison that built this huge cell house that's not really being used to its full potential on an island. So they decide they're going to turn Alcatraz over to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 1934. No longer a military fort or a military prison. Now we are in the Alcatraz that everyone thinks about. Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, the Birdman, Robert Stroud. But why are those the only stories we constantly hear about? Obviously, other people were here here, and other stories happened. So let's get to our third and final untold story, the one that happened in the federal prison years. We're going to tell that last story at the top of this hill here. We learned about the first prisoners of Alcatraz. They really weren't the worst of the worst. So, for our final story, I want to make it a little more positive so that we can leave here feeling a little bit lighter and better. But that's not to say those first two stories should not be told. There's definitely importance there. But our final story, I think it has some lessons that we can take with us in our lives. Our final story is about a man named Elliott Michener. Has anyone heard about Elliott Michener? Good. It's an untold story then. Sweet. Elliott was incarcerated here on Alcatraz for counterfeiting. He was making fake money and fake checks. Again, the worst of the worst? Making fake money. It's debatable. Either way, Elliott ends up here for doing that. While serving time on Alcatraz, Elliott gets the unofficial job of walking the perimeter of the recreation yard. He's walking that perimeter looking for any baseballs or any handballs that might have flown over the fence. It helps pass the time. It's what he does. One day, while looking for baseballs or handballs, Elliott finds something else. He finds a set of these. They are not his. They belong to a prison guard. Now, instead of doing what you might expect a criminal to do, which would be, don't tell anyone, put them in your pocket, save them, use them later, Elliott does no such thing. Elliott finds the nearest prison guard and returns the keys. The guards are shocked. They're gobsmacked. They said, "Elliott, wow, that was pretty admirable. We can't believe you did it. How can we thank you so that the other incarcerated men can see that good behavior goes rewarded?" So Elliott, he thought. Up until this time, Elliott noticed something. He noticed the plants on this island, the gardens of Alcatraz. These were gardens that were first put here during the military era. But when this island got turned over to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, no one cared about the gardens. So they became overgrown and unkempt. So Elliott said, "You can thank me by making me your lead gardener." He got the job. Now, we talk about escaping Alcatraz all the time, but we don't think about mentally escaping. Elliott got to garden every day and got to mentally escape this place. He was given a team of men to work with him, and one of Elliott's first orders of business was ordering some new plants. Elliott ordered one fig tree. He planted that fig tree on the west side of the island, the opposite side. That fig tree is still growing today. It has multiplied to roughly 100 fig trees. If you want to see them, you'll walk up this road and then it curves down onto the other side. In those fig trees today are nesting birds called snowy egrets. Beautiful white birds with long plumage on their heads. At one time, the snowy egret was almost hunted to extinction because their feathers were used in fashion. The Audubon Society was developed specifically to save the snowy egret. We have hundreds of them over on the other side. Go see them. Another tree that Elliott cared and tended to was a eucalyptus tree. That's the eucalyptus tree. This spring, there were 13 nests of great blue herons, giant birds with 7-foot wingspan. 13 nests this spring. As time goes on, Elliott is eventually released from Alcatraz because, again, he was only here for counterfeiting, not something you're going to spend your whole life in prison for. Upon his release, Elliott goes down to Los Angeles and he gets a job on a golf course as their lead landscaper. He turned his life around. But while working down in LA, Elliott could never get his mind off this island. He loved his gardens here. So he starts to write letters to the warden himself. Letters asking, how are my gardens? Is anyone taking care of them? Are the irises blooming? Letter after letter after letter. Eventually, the warden says, dude, enough with the letters. I cannot possibly read all of them or respond. Just do yourself a favor, give yourself some peace of mind, and come back to the island and check on your gardens yourself. Who here, raise your hand, would come back to a place that incarcerated or imprisoned them? Not many of us. One brave soul in the front. Elliott came back. That's how much he loved his gardens. Now, I think the 3 lessons that we can learn from Elliott's story before we go are lesson number 1, do the right thing. Elliott turned those keys in. The ripple effect that had. He got a job gardening, not only here on the island, but a job upon his release as a gardener. Also, that ripple effect of doing the right thing can sometimes go years beyond our own existence. Every spring, we have these birds that are nesting in plants that Elliott planted. Let's do the right thing. Lesson number 2. Don't let fear be a determining factor in something that you want. I'm sure Elliott was scared to return to Alcatraz, but he wanted to see his gardens bad enough. He did not let fear stand in his way. So let's not let fear stand in our way. And our final lesson is that I hope that never for a second any one of you lets your past mistakes or your past missteps determine who you are or who you can be in the future. We don't have to let our past define our future. Elliott did not let that happen to him. So let's not let that happen to us. With that, I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you for taking time to listen.
Is that the is that the prison? Are those the
There's showers.
Did you sleep in a room like how the prison was?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Was it like, were you in control of it? Did you like get out and stuff?
Mm-mm.
Oh, this is ahead of mine.
Они пишут здесь каждый, почему они его поставили сюда.
These people that were in here.
Ты знаешь, наверное, всего, когда он ставит, вот сейчас поставить машину. А ты руку заставить,
This is where you come. All there is this. Yeah, this is my little during apartment, so that it was all closed and then they don't go from here because they stuff out, so it was just over here. And I went to live at like 2 years ago.
Você fica jogando story.
You want this?
What the heck?
Holy moly.
Visitation, like people outside visit you so they can talk?
That's the end with the horse hair. That's just the place.
I know, but like, to let me give like.
There's no way I could break him. I couldn't fit through the hole.
Hey, these men have